Okay, so when you're decolonising anything, whether it's like a curriculum or your mind or childhood, it involves looking really critically at the dominant narrative and critiquing it. So we're talking about challenging societal norms, holding them up to scrutiny and asking questions of them. Is one group being shown in a more preferable light? Are there certain demographics that are being made invisible? What are the values that are being emphasised? So I'm going to talk a bit about all of these things, and then we'll explore these ideas further in the discussion. But everything that I'm talking about, it's really an introduction to this subject because there's so much more that could be said. So a little about me. My parents moved to the UK from India in the early 70s in response to an advert looking for doctors to work in British hospitals. They were both born before India gained independence from the British Empire in 1947. So their early childhoods were very heavily influenced by the colonial powers. My dad had been orphaned as a young child, and my mum's dowry was pretty much just made up of her degree. But they both really, really benefited from the social mobility and the very sort of proud internationalism that was possible in like the early years of the new nation. So I grew up in Salford and in Bolton in the 80s and 90s with a very, very close relationship to this massive Indian community in and around Greater Manchester. From a young age, I was really acutely aware of the misogyny in our community, and everyday and structural racism really coloured all of our lives. When I was 18, I moved to Glasgow and eventually had some children, and my children have one other parent besides myself who is white and male. So when both my older children are assigned female at birth, and when they were little, I made a conscious effort to encourage them to think critically with reference to gender and capital about the books that we were reading and the clothes that they wore, and just generally the choices that they made about the objects in their lives. And this happened mostly through asking questions of what was around us. So at this point, I wasn't thinking about looking for like feminist books. We were just making use of whatever we had in like the libraries and in the charity shops. We would read all these stories and we'd sort of wonder aloud about how they could have been told differently by the less prominent characters or even by the baddie. Could we offer compassion or empathy to characters other than the protagonist? How would the wolf had retold the Three Little Pigs story? We guessed that he needed to eat and he was a carnivore, so maybe pig was just the obvious choice of meal. We talked about how different genders were represented. Why were the older women in fairy tales always so ugly and so mean? And who decided what pretty looked like anyway? Who wrote the stories and what viewpoint were they pushing? And why were they pushing that viewpoint? So in a way, we were sort of forming our own Bechdel test for children's books. So if you've not come across it before, the Bechdel test comes from this comic, which is made by a woman called Alison Bechdel in 1985, and it's a comic called The Rule. And she credited her friend Liz Wallace for the idea behind the test. So sometimes it's called the Bechdel-Wallace test. So in order to pass the test, a film must have at least 2 named women in it. They have to talk to each other than man. Sometimes, in my life, and I'm sure in yours as well, the children didn't want to talk about these issues. Sometimes you just want to hear a good story and you don't want to have to think about all the things that are wrong with the world. So at these times, I'd use like a simple but non-disruptive way to challenge unhelpful stereotypes in books, just by changing the genders of the characters as I was reading. So obviously it's easier to do when your children are pre-literate. So he said would become she said. Firemen become firefighters, and in the world outside of books, the little green light that helps us cross the road is the green person, and we make snow people in the winter rather than snowmen. And even though these are just little things, language is really powerful, and so over time it can create quite deep shifts in thinking. So I thought I understood this point. I understood the damaging effects of patriarchy on women and girls, but then I had my first son. And within minutes of him being born, people were speaking to him differently to how they'd spoken to my other babies. Nobody had called my baby girls mate or pal. It was at this time that I really began to understand the negative effect that patriarchy has on men, and how they're only permitted to kind of occupy a very narrow space, and they're only allowed to display a very limited range of emotions. Market researchers Nielsen and the Observer newspaper did an in-depth analysis of the 100 most popular children's books in 2017. And their analysis revealed that lead characters in children's books for any age were twice as likely to be male, with the villains 8 times as likely to be male. Similarly, characters with any dialogue were twice as likely to be male. Female adults were more often shown in caregiving roles, with teachers twice as likely to be depicted as female than male. 40% of the gendered characters were humans, with the rest being an assortment of like animals, plants, objects, aliens, dinosaurs, monsters, that kind of thing. And the gender bias was even more likely for non-human characters, who were 73% more likely to be male. Unsurprisingly, the male animals tended to be like large and powerful and predatory, so like tigers and bears and monsters. And the female animals tended to be smaller and more vulnerable, so like mice or birds or cats. And they tended to be sidekicks rather than protagonists. And similarly, in children's films and TVs of the time, which is only 3 years ago, 31% of speaking characters were female. So female characters didn't get much of a say. So efforts have been made to address this, and there's a growing number of children's books being published which hope to bring some equality. But even the most well-meaning can unintentionally sort of hit the wrong note. So the picture you see here is the really massively popular Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, which you can see one of my children has doctored to say Goodnight Stories about rebel girls, because this caused a lot of offence in my house, because they were saying, why are stories about women for girls? Surely stories about women are for anybody. Strong female role models are important for all genders. So why does this matter? It matters because children learn about the world through play and through the books and media and culture that they're exposed to. So the culture that you absorb tells you something about the way that society sees you. It tells you something about who you can be and what you can be. The gender biases that I've described are preparing children for a world where men are able, or they have to, lead. They're powerful and they're often aggressive. They have important things to say and they're going to be heard. A world where women are caregivers and they're sidekicks or they're vulnerable. Their words are less important. Sometimes they don't get any words at all. They don't show anger, they don't show aggression, and they often need some male assistance to get through life. So the full spectrum of emotion isn't available for boys, and there's a sort of an equally limited set of expectations for girls with regards to who they can be in the world. So if we're coached through this like constant exposure to see this as normal, we're less likely to be able to identify it. And if we can't identify it, we're not going to be able to challenge it, whether as children or as adults. So you might ask how this relates to decolonising, because many pre-colonial societies had quite distinct gender roles and gender expectations, but decolonising as a methodology involves learning to recognise systems of oppression and how they affect the way that you think and the way that you live. It involves freeing the mind, critiquing positions of power, and examining the dominant culture. So going back to my journey, by this time, my eldest was about 5, and their peers had started school and were absorbing more and more mainstream culture, and I was becoming really conflicted about imposing restrictions on what my children were exposed to at home, but came to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, that if at home we only watched and read things with positive gender representation, anti-capitalist or non-competitive messaging, and made a point of openly questioning anything other, it will create a certain sense of normal. And this sense of normal that put critical thinking, a cooperative attitude to life, and equality at the centre of everything. So in the same way that a subtle gender bias in children's literature and media can drip feed this idea of inferiority, so I concluded the opposite must be true, that surrounding a child with stories and images of people of all genders living full and rich lives would embed the notion that all people's voices and dreams are valid. by this thinking, when the children are exposed to the dominant ideals of mainstream culture, they would sort of jump out and jar, and they would notice them as being unjust. So as the years have gone by, I've noticed that around the age of about 7 or 8, questioning and viewing the world through a more decolonised lens has become second nature to each of my children. So maybe there's something in my theory, but I only have my own anecdotal evidence to support that. So one aspect of colonial thinking that's quite markedly different to pre-colonial cultures is to do with the notion of the individual, that you sort of strike out on your own and you make good of your life. And it fits with the capitalist narratives about success and progress. And it also fits with our relationship with the natural world. So this is how we operate in the natural world as well. So we take what we need, and more often we take more than what we need, without thinking about how it's going to affect the ecosystem as a whole. And the climate and ecological emergency that we find ourselves in now is the culmination of this colonialist project that has extractivism and exploitation at its heart. Interdependency is very rarely highlighted, either in stories about human or non-human life. So once again, in searching for an antidote to all of that, I turned to the opposite of individualism, and have been slowly building up a collection of stories that show that. So stories that illustrate how working together makes life easier, it makes life richer, it makes life more joyful. Stories that show that we really need to rely on each other. But as well as reading stories about people working together, I felt that we needed to engage in like real life cooperative activity. So I've made a point of creating situations or putting ourselves in situations where we're having potluck dinners, or we're doing communal cooking or cooperative crafts or non-competitive cooperative games, so that it's, as well as reading about it, we can live it as well. So when one of my children was about 4, they started to experience regular violent racist bullying. So a child that lived close to us and that attended many of the same groups that we went to took a dislike to her, and he would shout at her that she was dirty and that she mustn't touch anything because she was dirty. But he only ever did this out of earshot of adults. And he punched her and he kicked her, and once he even tried to push her into a bonfire. And my daughter started to develop a real sort of self-loathing. And that made me much more aware of the white supremacist nature of so much of children's culture. So because we hadn't been looking for particular books at this point, and we were just picking up whatever we could find, most of the characters in the books and films we were using were white. And my gut feeling was that this was unhelpful, but I didn't have anything to back this up. So I started looking for like studies to support this. At the time, which was about 2013, I couldn't find much very easily on the subject of children's literature and racism, but I did find a helpful analogy that had been made in a number of blogs that I'd been reading between people of colour and vampires in movies. So vampires have got no shadow. They look into a mirror and they don't see themselves, they only see the world around them. In the same way, people of colour watch movies, watch TV, read books with exclusively or majority white characters, and we don't see ourselves. So over time, we begin to internalise that we are like those vampires and monsters, just like the ones that we see in the movies. So we're to be feared and we're to be eliminated. And if that's how we're seeing ourselves, how must the white people be seeing us? So the next year in 2014, the Irish drag queen, Panty Bliss, made an impassioned speech about homophobia. It was really, really widely viewed and written about in Ireland. It was very well received. She spoke about how she'd internalised the oppression that was sort of heaped on her as a gay person in Ireland. And this really resonated with me. At the time, I'd already started unpicking my internalised misogyny, but it was the first time that I really confronted my internalised racism. And I could see that my child was taking on board all those racist slurs being hurled at her and starting to believe them to be true. And I could see, when I really looked closely, that I had done the same myself for decades. And looking around me, I started to notice more and more examples of people who would challenge really overt sexism and racism, but they were still holding on to their unconscious biases without investigating them or questioning them. In leaving them unchallenged, anybody that wasn't questioning their unconscious bias, we're upholding the systems of oppression and we're perpetuating them. So this was when I realised that an important part of decolonising your thinking is having some humility, because we do, regardless of where we're at in our journey, we all hold these biases, and we need to work consistently and with real honesty to unlearn them. And it's really painful work at times, and it takes time and it takes a lot of energy. But if we don't undo these biases, if we don't really examine them, it becomes really difficult to recognise them elsewhere. And if we can't recognise them, we can't push for any change. So I began to look more closely at the parts given to the few people of colour in children's culture. This book helped me a lot. This is Julia Donaldson's Jack and the Flum Flum Tree, that my children at the time really loved. It's got a great rhythm. But then you start to think a bit more about Stubble Cheeked Sue, the hapless sidekick, and Red Cheeked Rose, the silent female sidekick. So the few people of colour in children's culture, they were typically faithful sidekicks, often tragically killed early on in the story, or they were figures of fun that you could laugh at. They were very unlikely to have a speaking part, and if they did speak, it would be in order to support a white character. So the more I read, the more I talked to my children about what I was learning, in the hope that we could learn together. And one day I remember one of the children pointing out to me, they had this Lift the Flap book about space, and in it, all the black characters were asking the questions and the white characters were giving all the answers. So once we started looking for it and we knew what we were looking for, we started to see a clear white supremacist agenda everywhere. So why is that? Why does that matter? Children's author Nikkei Shukla says, when you're figuring out the world, being able to see yourself in books, as well as people who don't look like you, is really important. It means you see your story as valid, and it can contribute to who you imagine yourselves to be. And a kid should be able to imagine themselves as anyone in the world. These mirrors are so important. And this, I think, is at the heart of why it's vital for children to see role models that look like themselves in the stories they read. It offers children a reminder that they matter and that there's a place for them in the world. It shows them they can be heroes, or they can go on adventures, they can save the world. It's sort of an affirmation that they exist and that their concerns are valid. It's equally important for children who are well represented in mainstream culture. White, able-bodied children living in heterosexual nuclear families, to see a diversity of characters in the culture that they absorb too, so that they too know that the dreams and thoughts, ideals, adventures of children who don't look like them are just as valid as their own. Unfortunately, a study conducted by the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education found that only 4% of the children's books published in 2017 had a character that was a person of colour. So that doesn't mean they were the protagonist, it just meant there was a character. The researchers also analysed the quality of the representation as well as the quantity, and they found that more than half of the books featuring a Black, Asian or minority ethnic character were classed as contemporary realism, and 10% of those contained social justice issues like war and conflict. Only one of the books featuring a character of colour was defined as comedy. So the report states that every child is entitled to feel safe and valued, and that in the current socio-political and economic climate, the risk of marginalisation is even greater. So it warns publishers that if children don't see their realities reflected in the world around them, or they only see like a problematic representation mirrored back at them, the impact can be tremendously damaging. So what are these damaging effects on children if they're not represented in the culture they consume? There's many, but some of them are that they start to feel invisible. Their engagement with academia might drop, and they feel like your aspirations are not realistic. Body image can also be poor, because if you're only exposed to white beauty ideals that you're never going to be able to achieve, you're never going to reach the pinnacle of like beauty or pretty even. Children that are well represented will begin to think of their underrepresented peers as lesser, so less intelligent, less attractive, less interesting, less able. There've been many studies that show that very young children will show a preference for faces that look like their own, but by the time that they're about 4 years old, almost all children, regardless of their own skin colour, tend to show a preference for white faces. This suggests that being conscious of what children are exposed to from a very young age is really important. So the image here is from an experiment that's been done quite a number of times, where young children are shown two dollies. There's a black dolly and a white dolly, and they're asked lots of questions about how they feel about the dollies. Which one of the babies is beautiful? Which one's a bit naughty? Which one do you love? And then the vast majority of children, regardless of their own skin colour, will give the more positive attributes to the white doll than to the black doll. So after doing all this research and creating list after list of books, I figured it would make sense to put them out in the world, because there's other children out there who are underrepresented on the high street other than my own, and they need to find books as well with children that look like them and families that look like their families. So we started selling children's books at II Books, and I'd begun looking at race and positive gender representation, and it very quickly led on to looking for books with LGBTQIA+ characters and queer families. As well as addressing heteronormativity, it felt important to challenge the binary Western lens through which children's literature often views gender. So European colonialists have a very long history of oppressing and slaughtering people in countries that they colonised who didn't fit the binary gender expectations. So examples include Hijra in India, who were officially recognised as a third gender, and they had traditionally been really powerful figures, but their existence was criminalised by the colonial powers. And similarly, in Indigenous communities in North America, two-spirit people don't fit into the binary gender model. And in pre-colonial times, they held significant roles. They were a really integral part of tribal social structures, but the colonial powers persecuted them and attempted to erase them entirely. So I'm really sorely aware and disappointed that children with disabilities are still very poorly represented, both in our selection of books at the bookshop, but also generally in the world. It's really difficult to find good stories with disabled characters in. We've had a small handful of books in the shop that have had disabled characters over the years, but they've not been very well written, and they're usually about disability, then tend not to be about the children's dreams and adventures. So when we get to the discussion, if people have recommendations, I'd really love to hear them. And then it was only when we had our first children's book sale event that I realised, really properly got my head around, that the white children from middle-class heterosexual nuclear families needed to see all of these other children in their books too. It just takes a while for the penny to drop sometime. All children need to have decolonised childhoods. White parents and educators working with white middle-class children need to be working hard and need to be working consistently to decolonise their own thinking and the environments in which white children are being raised. Because children that carry privilege need to be aware of it, and they need space in which to talk about it and understand it and learn how to use their privilege to elevate marginalised voices. They need to learn how to be allies. Assimilating the messages from a system of oppression hurts all of us, and dismantling those systems requires people from all demographics working towards that. But decolonising our thinking and our children's lives stretches beyond thinking about race and gender and class and sexuality and disability. We need to consider anything that pushes a singular narrative. So this is Thomas Carlyle. There's a statue of him in our local park, and this is the only photo I have of that statue. So he was a controversial, very openly racist writer and historian from the 19th century, and he was a leading exponent of the great man theory. So he said that the history of the world was the biography of great men. And what he means by that is that leaders are gifted individuals. These great men tend to be people of wealth and privilege, so they tend to be white, male, and aristocratic. And the collective doesn't make it into the history books. It's deemed of no value because, well, I think anyway, powerful people have a fear of collective action. So high street bookshops these days are increasingly stocking books about great figures in history that aren't white and they aren't male, but they're still clinging to this notion of history being made by individuals. And so by getting caught up with replacing the great white men that have been held up as heroes with great women of colour, we're falling back into that colonialist paradigm. For me, and I think for many people, this is the most difficult notion to break out of because it's really deeply ingrained in the world around us. So if this is new to you, where do you begin? I think now is a really, really good time to start looking to decolonise your children's bookshelves or toy boxes and viewing. There are umpteen book lists, blogs and videos being published on the subject almost daily. The most readily available books and book lists and resources are American. So you just do a quick internet search and you could easily draw up a list of books with Black characters about Black history in America. And this is absolutely brilliant. We should all learn Black history. But maybe it would also be helpful and maybe would be more in keeping with the spirit of the exercise to think about your own context. So many of us and the kids we know about Rosa Parks taking a stand on the buses, but do we all know and do the kids know about the Bristol bus boycotts? And why is it that we know about American Black history and not British Black history if that's where you live? So where do you live? Can you find anything that's based in your city or in your country? What are the demographics close to where you live and you work and you play? So what do the kids look like at your local play park? Is that what the kids in the books that you read look like? What's your own family's history? In our house, we've got quite a few books featuring first and second generation Indian immigrants and mixed race families, because that's what resonates with our situation. We found it next to impossible to find that ticks all the boxes. So if there's good representation, there might be a storyline that privileges capitalist values. There's usually a storyline that privileges capitalist values. If there's no gender bias, there might be poor race representation. Maybe it's all looking good, and then you realise that the messages contained are really heteronormative and you start pulling your hair out. All of this presents brilliant opportunity for discussion and questioning. So there's something worthwhile to be found in all your resources. So as with the Bechdel-Wallace test for gender representation, the film critic Manohla Dargis developed the DuVernay test, named after the director Ava DuVernay. So Dargis explains that in films that pass the test, African Americans and other minorities have fully realised lives rather than serving as scenery in white stories. So the DuVernay test doesn't yet have defined rules. So the slide that you can see here is a suggestion of what the rules could be. I've seen somewhere else another list of rules could be, are there two named characters of colour? Do they have dialogue that's not supporting or comforting a white character? Are they not romantically involved with each other? Is one of them definitely not magic? Because this is something that's used quite often. You want to your representation, you stick in a person of colour who's magic, so their lives and their feelings are not quite the same as the white characters. So maybe the DuVernay test is something that you could play about with the children in your life and come up with your own questions. But most of all, I think it needs to be decolonising, it needs to be appealing to children. So it's grueling and boring and emotionally draining, especially for marginalised children, to only read and watch things that are worthy or that talk about cruel and miserable oppression. When I told my eldest that I was doing this talk, they said, there are so many books that cram in all the diversity to make them popular with a certain crowd, but there's often no decent story. So I really urge you to look for books that have good characters that are three-dimensional. It's important that those from minority backgrounds don't only get a platform when suffering is being explored. So children need to be able to recognise and name oppression, but we are all more than our struggles, and it's vital that all children are raised to feel joy, which is why I leave you with Spider-Man. And so now I'm going to throw the ball out to you as people with children in your lives. You're adults. You have a responsibility to help them understand the world. you've got a great deal of power to affect how the world is presented to them. Whether the children in your life are from an underrepresented minority group or whether they're from a demographic that's very heavily represented in mainstream culture, the conversations that you have and the stories that you expose children to will impact on how they see themselves and how they see the people around them, which could either perpetuate the current power imbalances or it could challenge them. So I guess a question could be, I mean, not necessarily for us to speak about openly with each other, but one for yourself could be, where do you personally go from here?